with this second or third look at the Witcher 3 update, I wanted to take a deeper dive into the AMD version, the PC version as a whole, and also extend my point about the issues and the value that this free update really offers. So, looking at the title on PC, an AMD card specifically, where I concentrated my time on the RTX cards last time in Nvidia, then roughly we are getting a bad deal here if you are an AMD player. Taking the RX 6800, which on paper is around 70 to 80% faster than my RTX 2070, even with an overclock, putting it closer to a 2070 Super, we're only seeing on average 27% performance improvement in like-for-like test here with DX12 on, fully ultra at 4K TAAU and no ray tracing. That is a poor return for AMD players, no matter which way you cut it, and that doesn't even take into account the better CPU this is running with. If we turn on ray tracing, we don't see much of a difference, and again, even though the RX 6800 is likely to be performing worse than the rasterization score we've just seen, it should be better than 39%, but some of that is down to the CPU helping it out, which is a terrible result and just reinforces my point earlier around the fact that AMD players are getting a very bad result on this update, and that really is an Nvidia sponsored title. It's not the first time this has happened, but this update really does impact AMD players, which is likely a contributing factor to why it doesn't perform that great on the Series X and PlayStation 5.
Come closer, don't be shy.
Ain't nothing pretty in this life, save
You've normally
all
paid
sweaty and all that armour.
What do you care?
Wouldn't you rather sweat on me?
Now, performance is bad due to thread hopping. It looks like they're not locked any affinity to the threads or CPUs at all with the jobs, and they're probably just doing it by process, which means Windows itself is just flipping between threads based on that work priority, and that means utilization is poor. Flipping between 25 to 50% at best utilization on the CPU, but that's overall. It's moving work back and forth on the threads as you see here. That happens on every CPU you've got, but the faster the single core thread, or at least the faster the overall CPU, that's going to get you better performance, but it's really underutilizing every CPU it has, and a lot of this will be context switching, memory, and all that kind of stuff that I talk about a lot, because it's causing all these idle points. And you can see here that the GPU is then idling as well, not only in the allocation of work in the GPU command queue, but also on power and usage, which means on every piece of hardware you've got, it's fundamentally stalling and then for rushing to the end of the work to then get a next stall, wait for the next piece of work and go back and forth. Now, the latest patch does improve CPU performance, the version Hotfix version 4.02 I'm calling it, but actually it makes performance slightly worse on AMD cards and AMD GPUs, so I don't know what's gone on there. So they definitely need to improve that, because now it's definitely using more CPU time, but it's still causing even bigger stalls on the GPU, and performance isn't better. It can actually be worse at certain points. Now, therefore, this means that they definitely have some issues in their overall code, and this is reinforced by the fact that even when you're running DX12 but ray tracing turned off, both system RAM and VRAM is higher. Around 250 to 300 megabytes of VRAM is used when it shouldn't be being used because there's no additional work there from ray tracing, and around 3 gigabytes of system RAM, which means potentially it's using both CPU time, GPU time, bandwidth, and storage, and all of this adds up to underutilization on all pieces of hardware running DX12. And this was reinforced by my previous test in terms of the fact you lose around 10% going from an RTX 2070, DX11, DX12 exact same settings, and this is exactly the same on the AMD card. Kind of. You see, the DirectX 11 driver on AMD cards is worse than the DX12 driver for AMD cards, and this means that even though the highs and the average is better on DX11, it doesn't get so many judders and stutters that it does on the DX11 driver, which means overall the gap is slightly better between DX11 and DX12 for AMD cards because of this issue. Basically, the Nvidia DX12 driver is nowhere near as good as their DX11 driver, and therefore the gap can be worse at certain points. But overall, the performance is still worse under DirectX 12 than DirectX 11, even on AMD cards, but some of that is mitigated by the fact that AMD have a better driver for DX12. With the comparison between the Nvidia cards and the AMD cards complete, we know the cost of ray tracing is very expensive. And obviously one of the big benefits of going to DX12 is having the option to turn on dynamic scaling and or FSR or DLSS. So everything I say here is based on an AMD card and FSR, but if you have DLSS, then just flip to the equivalent of that because it's slightly more performant and it certainly has better performance. But go and check out my previous video which covers the Nvidia card and all the image quality and consoles in much more depth. So fundamentally what we need to do is ascertain how much the cost of ray tracing at a certain level has on the card and then try and get the best performance we can. 60 FPS even on this particular machine in an RX 6800 powered with a Zen 3 is 5600X. Doesn't have the option of running 60 FPS no matter what resolution you run it at because it becomes CPU bound more often than not. In fact, the entire game is heavily CPU bound once you've got ray tracing on, and even with it off in certain areas such as Novigrad, it can still be heavily CPU bound. So taking that into account, the first test you saw, taking the baseline of DX12 and DX11, with DX11 being the highest level with a high of 81, a low of 51 and an average of 66.2 in that test through Novigrad, that's our baseline of best performance on this card in the CPU. And then taking that over to the DX12 version with exactly the same settings, we can see a reduction in that quality quite significantly in certain areas, but overall it's only 11.8%. So like I say, slightly better than it is on an Nvidia card due to that shift in the driver for AMD. But as I've already covered, once we turn on ray tracing, even with reduced settings using FSR balanced, you're still getting sub 20 FPS at certain points on an RTX 2070 and sub 30 on an RX 6800. Now you can go lower, obviously you need some GPU headroom here, so using the same RX 6800 but going to 1800p gives us better performance. But remember, this is FSR balance, so you're somewhere just under 1080p, around 1888 by 1062 at this point in terms of native resolution, but it's still much better than 1080p and closer to 1440p in terms of image quality, but you get some performance back. Here you can see side-by-side settings in terms of that base level with FSR balance using everything on max, and on the left you can see my optimized settings. This gives you a significant boost in performance. Now, the long and short of this is you need to change some of these in the INI settings. I covered that before. Now, not all of these things work, but one of the things I've reduced here is cut back on the level of detail that's at 1.5 by default. You can change this in the XML file and hopefully get it to work in the menu, which seems to fix the issue that I mentioned before. So when you change it in the menu, you can actually get it to go below on that detail level. In addition to that, I've also reduced the probes, the light probes that ray tracing uses to calculate the light and the radiance in the game itself. Now, obviously, I can't get to where the actual raycasts are done and reducing that per ray and the shader cost there, but I'm sure there's options somewhere within the INIs here to try and change some of these options. Maybe that's something I can look at a later date, but I wouldn't guarantee it because time is always of the essence. But overall, these reduced settings you can see look like this in the menu, and that optimized level gives you a significant boost on performance. So as a baseline, we know that DX12 has approximately 12% cost in terms of DX11 to 12. So using that as the baseline, going from 4K native Ultra Plus to ray tracing max 1800p FSR2 balance, we're losing 53% of our performance. That's huge. But using these optimized settings, we gain a lot of that back, bringing us back on average to 38.3%, an increase over that max settings. Nothing's changed other than those optimized settings I've just shown you and some more tweaking in the INI file. This means that on the highs, we're seeing a 38% increase over that baseline of 1800p max FSR balanced, and on the lows we're seeing 52%, going from 21 as a low to 32 as a low, which means you can realistically cap this title now at 30 FPS or even 40 FPS, which it will hover at most of the time if you have a 120Hz screen. Now remember, this game does benefit significantly by capping the frame rate because the frame times can be all over the place and you can get erratic frame times. And in addition, the cost of that latency that DX12 brings is also improved because it has a little bit of headroom left over and therefore it doesn't stack as many frames and you get better app latency. I covered that in my previous video. Fundamentally, all of these areas here though are just really reducing the impact on the CPU. It's not wasting time and therefore GPU utilization, as you can see at the top, is better for it. On these settings, you can now run around Novigrad and mostly hold a fixed 40 FPS as you see here, which is a significant improvement over the max settings you've got at 1800p FSR balanced. There might be other options we can work on, and I'm sure the team will be working away on these particular areas to try and reduce the cost and obviously add those into the menu so you can do things like reduce the AO cost, reduce the radiance cost, reduce the raise, so that all these options become easily configurable by you, the player, rather than messing around with game settings and innies, which is always tight even for me who's got some time to look at it and obviously some idea on what I'm looking at. Overall though, it's good that this is an option you can tweak it, but as it stands, it's still a very high performing title in terms of demands on the hardware, and the results don't always give you that payback because of the CPU cost. The two areas here, as I covered before, it's the DX12 area and that ray tracing cost. They're just far too high on both the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, and overall throughput of the system, which means these are the areas the team need to focus on. But there is one more area that I need to discuss in terms of the previous version, and are we getting really as big an improvement as we originally thought? So the new DirectX 11 boosts are really the same as the DX12 one, but compared to the old one, the new options are really a mix of the old high plus ultra. The performance impact going from the old DX11 to the new is approximately 18%, but that does include HBAO on in the older version, which is not an option now both in DX11 or 12, which itself can cost 9% over the old game's SSAO, which itself was actually pretty good. The other areas, it uses more RAM both in system and VRAM because it's using these 4K textures. Again, a lot of the updates here come from the modding community. That includes those real-time cinematics, the improvements to textures and updates across the board. So this does utilize more memory, bandwidth, texture filtering. All of that will have an impact on performance, and all of this stacks up, which is why you're seeing an 18% deficit here between the old versus new. Again, a big portion of that cost is that improved level of detail on the mesh LODs at 1.5. If you drop that down, you do gain some of that back. But if you set somewhere around high settings, it looks slightly better than it did before on the ultra settings with very similar performance, but you are getting better assets, texture details, grass and other areas across the board. Here, comparing the PS4, you can see that again that was closest to low on most settings, some of them below. And again, on the consoles, just briefly touching on that, I've seen some comments online in some areas. The Series X does have higher foliage than it does on the PlayStation 5, as does the Series S, as I covered before, but there is a bug on that version, and I'll get to it in a moment. But fundamentally, both the PS5, Series X and Series S, in the quality mode at least, are closest to the ultra settings on all options. Some of them are ultra plus, aside the LOD level, which is still at 1.0 as I covered before. So moving back to comparisons of the older and newer versions, let's specifically talk around one of the biggest sacrifices, which is the lack of HBAO+ and even a cutback in SSAO. Now, I have seen comments online around the fact that HBAO+ fixes it and it's just as good as RTAO, and that's not exactly true. But it is significantly better than SSAO, which itself is actually heavily reduced now on the newer version over the old 1.32 version, as you can see here. Now, in addition to this, the latest hotfix has also removed that old DX11 on 12 DLL that I mentioned in my previous video, which may have been an oversight by the team when they released it, or they no longer need it at all and they've just removed it. But for whatever reason, it's now gone, so it's fully relying on DX12 now, which doesn't make a huge amount of difference to performance. So I'm leaning on the fact they've left it there by mistake and they didn't actually need it originally. That's my assumption anyway. But overall, the impact is still pretty high on CPU, as I've already just covered. So visual quality is reduced. HBAO is no longer possible, and SSAO, as you can see here, isn't as good as the old version. But in addition to this, you can see some comparisons now between the old HBAO Ultra and the new Ultra Plus version, just to show the difference between that and RTAO on and RT on. You can see that there are some points where it's significantly better, the quality of the image, the grass, the color gradient, all of that, and definitely the ambient occlusion is better in the newer version, significantly. But if you left the old SSAO or even the older HBAO in there, some of that isn't quite as impressive because HBAO does a good job. And you can certainly see areas here where the ambient occlusion area from the outside and inside is pretty close using the newer version to the older version with HBAO+, and I do actually prefer the old SSAO significantly over the newer version, and I noted this in my console review on the IGN channel. The PlayStation 4 version and the older version did look better in some places than the newer performance mode on both the Series X and PlayStation 5 because of this heavy reduction in ambient occlusion. The old SSAO was better on that console, and that to me smacks of either an intentional reason to improve the new quality, which I hope I'm wrong on that, or it's just an oversight in the updates they've made and they've not actually gone back and corrected this version in DX12 and the DX11 version as well. Overall though, I do hope they go back and put it back in because it means that you can run this on slightly weaker GPUs and still get better visual quality. But this is mitigated on PC specifically because you can go back both on Steam and GOG, as you see here, and download the older version, which is what you should do yourself to just try it and obviously not take me or anyone else's word for gospel. Test these areas, look at it yourself, compare it on your own machine and see what you think. Again, it's always a case of compromising here. You look at one version to the next and people might choose that the older HBAO version looks better than the newer RTAO one. They might go back and forth. There's certainly areas that are significantly better in the newer version no matter what. Interiors specifically, the bounce of light, all of that isn't possible on the old version. So don't get me wrong, there are some changes here, but colour gradient, light bounce, specifically around grass and trees, all of that has been improved, as has the foliage overall, which I covered in my Cyberpunk 2077 review of FSR 2.0. Go and check that out on the channel with the link below and on screen. And as I mentioned in that video, I did think a lot of the updates around FSR and the foliage were to do with this title, and again, they are. A lot of the updates here have been crossed over from that title to this, and that means that some of the same issues that I covered in that video and others I've also covered over, which is a good part to talk about bugs and go back to that point I mentioned before about the Series X and the PlayStation 5 foliage setting. There's comments online that have said that the PS5 actually has higher foliage settings than the Series X and grass and stuff, and that's just not true. Everything is set to the highest level in terms of trees, so foliage, not grass. It's actually higher than the PlayStation 5, as I covered, which is much closer to just the base PS4. Now, this is not always the case, but when you play the Series S version and run it at performance mode and then make a save and then use your cross save, your cloud saves over to the Series X and then continue the game, not load it but continue it on the Series X, what you'll end up with is the same settings as the Series S, which means both modes at that point in the Series X, even if you flip back and forth between quality and performance, as you can see compared here, you get that reduced grass setting that the Series S performance mode has. Now, I noted this in my IGN review that Series X has the higher foliage setting than PlayStation 5, as does the Series S. But the grass is reduced on Series S when it's in performance mode to help it in terms of performance for 60 FPS, because it's very impactful on fill rate and bandwidth, which is what's going to impact the console and PC no matter what you do when you whack it up to these high levels. Now, comparing them side by side, you can drastically see how much that cutback is, but this is only a bug when you're using cross saves between Series X and Series S. Most people won't be doing that, and I think that's why it's cropped up online with people testing it incorrectly. I mentioned this before in my Cyberpunk 2077. The same issue happens in that. When you cross saves, even with the last generation on Xbox One X over to Series X, you can end up with the wrong LOD, even some of the ray tracing not working. All of that can happen back and forth, and sometimes you can even get the Series S to run higher settings than it should do, and you get really bad performance. So this is a red engine issue itself, fundamentally, and the updates here have gone backwards into Witcher 3 and it's now affecting that. Potentially you could probably even do it, maybe, by using the cross-save system in GOG from PC to PS5, but I just don't have the time. But if somebody out there does, try it yourself if you get time to test it and see if you can get that to work. It might end up being you can actually force the PS5 and Series X to play higher graphical settings than it currently ships with. Who knows? I'm not saying it's possible, but it is potentially possible. The other area of this is the fact that the performance mode ini file on the PC itself, and I'm sure it's the same on Series X and Series S, actually has a Lockhart performance being true or false. So this is possibly why it's happening, if that ini file setting there is set to true, and therefore it can flip over to that performance mode that Lockhart has. Remember, Lockhart is the development name for the Series S. So to round up and close off the console version, so let's go back to the last generation release. The PS4 version performed significantly worse than the Xbox One, which we all knew back then. I covered it in detail. It was significantly less powerful than the PS4. That continued for a while before everyone realised that was the case. Many outlets should have said different, but they didn't. This was a good title that kind of flipped that on its head, and the Xbox One performed better than the PS4 often. That was performed and improved across many updates, which I covered in depth, and that was largely related to APIs and all that kind of area that I've discussed to death. It performs very well 95% of the time, but again, in CPU-heavy areas, it can still dip often on the PS4 into the low 20s, and that's exactly the same on the Xbox One, which is likely CPU-related. This is the same case on the Xbox One X, which has similar dips, but it can perform pretty close to locked 60 FPS, even from the disk code, again, which I covered back then. But the PS5, the Series X and the Series S still don't have perfect performance, and in some ways they mirror that original release. Certainly the PS5 in the performance mode performs much better on average than the Series X. There are some points where it can dip, yes, but it can dip on both consoles, but it dips more often, more frequently on the Series X, but only into the low 50s and sometimes the high 40s. VRR helps, and that will help on both consoles, including the Series S, which can dip almost the same, and that is largely CPU related, not GPU related. And in fact, most of the issues here are CPU in my opinion. The PS5 performs worse overall than the Series X in that ray tracing mode, but again, VRR won't help there, and both of them can dip, with the Series X tearing occasionally at the top 10th or 25% of the top of the screen, which can be hard to spot, but it is definitely there and it helps out performance. But overall, the Series X performs better than the PS5 in the ray tracing mode. And the Series S is pretty much spot on with a 30 FPS quality mode, no real issues noted. So that means you still get a great title and it is free. So what are my closing thoughts on it then? Well, as it stands, exactly the same as I've said before. This is likely a small team update, and they have achieved great results for a free update. Again, I'm stressing that free update. But the ray tracing hit is too high. The BVH cost still appears to be present in DX12, even when it's turned off. Approximately 250, 300 megabytes of VRAM, 2 to 3 gigabytes of system RAM means that bandwidth, CPU time are all being used, leaving low utilization when it's not needed. And this is backed up by my weaker RTX 2070, even with a RT on or off, not performing that much worse than a much more powerful RX 6800, and even actually probably performing around the same or there or thereabouts as the Series X and PlayStation 5, which are both also more powerful. Ultimately, it still needs patches to enable better non-ray trace performance and ray tracing performance on both Series X, PS5 and PC, the option to flip it. But we must keep in mind that it is £6.99 on PC, but a worse deal on console with around £20 for the complete version or £14.99 for the standard one, which still gets you the update to this but without the DLC, which is a great deal, and one I think could be remedied if they enable you to download the older versions of both the Pro version and the Xbox One X version, although the Pro version doesn't have a 60 FPS mode, so maybe not. And as I've said, you can already do that on the GOG version and on Steam, so that means the PC version is still the best way to pick up this title and play it now. And I would recommend that you do that because it runs brilliantly if you go back to the standard DX11 version and just set it somewhere between high and ultra. You get all the benefits I've just mentioned, you get all that DLC, and it's £7 for one of the best games of last generation, without a doubt. But there are some tweaks and updates here which I think are either at best a bit of a mistake or at worst done intentionally to improve the quality of these ray tracing areas. The cross-save bug is frustrating but likely very rare in general day-to-day use, and the PC sacrifices and console in terms of CPU utilization and the quality of the ray tracing compared to the payback is some area that I wish the team would focus on, but that's highly unlikely considering this is now end of life in terms of an engine, and this is likely just to boost sales until we go into the remake of The Witcher original on Unreal Engine 5. Visually, it is still a great looking title and it does have a lot of presentation in the box, but there are some niggles here that I think could be fixed and remedied, and certainly you're getting a better deal on PC because you can still go back to the older version for that $6.99 price, so having the option on consoles to flip between the versions, although probably highly unlikely, is still a benefit therein. So buying the disc version and then getting the free update is probably still the very best option you can choose. Anyway, remember I am completely self-funded and independent, and I do these as a side gig to my full-time job. If you like this or anything else that I do, please like, share and all that good stuff. And this is the last video for 2022, but I will be back in 2023 with far more details, some updates to the channel, and also how I do certain videos and quality to try and balance it out between what I do here and what I do over on IGN. So please stick with me, and if you can, support me over on Patreon for exclusive access, early access and all that good stuff. Anyway, Happy New Year to you all, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Guards! Oh, I'll smash your face!